President Trump reportedly said to the Israeli prime minister, everyone hates your country right now.
He's just getting frustrated with how he got into a war and looks like something of a strategic failure for the US.
US public opinion has kind of shifted against Israel. If I was in the Israeli government, I think that would be my primary concern.
Hi, guys. Great to see you again. And here we are talking about President Trump's relationships once again with those who he considers his close allies and friends, and perhaps how some of those relationships are changing a bit.
Yeah, it's been a frustrating week, you would imagine, for those in the White House between foreign relationships and domestic relationships. There was that blazing row, of course, that was first reported by Axios between the president and the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, which both men since confirmed in interviews did actually happen. And then later in the week, or sort of alongside that, we've had various members of the Republican Party taking issue with some of the policies coming from the White House in a way that we haven't seen before. So we might just have a chat about all of that over the next while. But let's start with Benjamin Netanyahu, because that's a really fascinating relationship, isn't it? How that's kind of ebbed and flowed over the years.
I think that one's particularly interesting, because the president was clearly a bit flustered that these negotiations with Iran could have been completely derailed by Israeli operations in Lebanon. I think he made that very clear. But also, it's not the first time he's been upset with Netanyahu. People might remember after Operation Midnight Hammer last year, President Trump famously came out to the lawn and in front of all the reporters used an expletive to say that Netanyahu and the Iranians don't know what they're doing with regards to the ceasefire that was in place there. So it's not as if it's his first time at the rodeo, but President Trump was clearly quite upset. For him to confirm it publicly, I think says a lot.
And that he used
Perturbed
those
was the word, wasn't it?
perturbed, and he confirmed that he used those expletives because, as he said, you can have those types of conversations with close friends and family. At least that's the way that both men seem to portray this, and that their relationship is still very strong. In fact, they say that they talk near daily about this conflict and security in the region. But if you look at the fact that we've talked on this pod before about the American and Israeli interests in this war in particular diverging at some key points, this is a classic example of that. And if you see Prime Minister Netanyahu, of course, under pressure at home, some of the more hawkish members of his own coalition and his opposition critics have accused him of making Israel into a kind of vassal state of the US. And the fascinating thing is that's some of the accusations that you hear among, let's say, the far right faction of the MAGA party here, is that America is doing Israel's bidding in this war. And so you see them trading these accusations, and that has served as kind of fodder for that argument between the two men.
And I think in a way that's inevitable when you have two nations launching a military offensive together that hasn't really worked out perhaps the way they would have imagined it at the beginning, that each nation is going to try and blame the other, aren't they? Especially when those sort of, as you're talking about, the domestic pressures start piling on in Israel and here in the US, of course. But it's a curious one to look at when you see some of the reporting that came out about the days leading up to President Trump's decision to launch this war with Israel on Iran. Obviously, Prime Minister Netanyahu had been in the US just a few weeks previously, and Marco Rubio even confirming, didn't he, on Capitol Hill a few days later, that, the US had kind of gone into this with Israel, and if they hadn't, there would have been a strike by Iran on Israel, and they would have been dragged into the war anyway. But you have to also remember that Prime Minister Netanyahu is very experienced in dealing with US presidents. I mean, he's met, I think, 7 US presidents during his sort of life in Israeli political life. So he's used to the going around the block and the ups and downs of those relationships.
And he certainly had a lot of downs in the past. I mean, his relationship with President Obama was notoriously bad. He went in front of Congress and spoke without having told the White House that was the plan first. With Biden, it was quite bad. But I think now one of the main differences is that U.S. public opinion has kind of shifted against Israel to a certain degree. I was just looking at one poll from Pew and said about 60% of Americans have a not very good opinion of Israel. Prior to the war with Hamas beginning in 2023, that number was in the low 40s. So one wonders now if there isn't kind of a political expediency or a political benefit for Trump and perhaps for subsequent US presidents showing a bit of daylight between the US and Israel. Because, I mean, in Trump's case, he was already quite put on the spot by the resignation of Joe Kent, for example, specifically because Joe Kent believed that Israel had gotten the US into this war with Iran. So he's already had to explain that relationship in the past. So it might benefit him to have that disagreement in such a public fashion with Netanyahu.
And that was really underlined by, at least from what we heard from the Axios reporting, that President Trump reportedly said to the Israeli prime minister, everyone hates your country right now. Again, that is from the reporting that we saw from Axios, and that piece of it wasn't necessarily confirmed, but it does kind of point to what you were talking about there, Bernd, which is just how opinion in the US has shifted over the last few years in particular. And that includes, most interestingly, among Republicans and MAGA Republicans. We've talked about some of those big right-wing influencer voices like Tucker Carlson, like Candace Owens and others who have really questioned that U.S. relationship with Israel. We had a pollster from Politico on our programs this week who was saying precisely that that shift has been more generally across the broad cross-section of America, but we've seen it shifting a bit among Republicans. You wonder if that will lead to any sort of shift in policy in the White House and how the White House looks at Israel as its ally in the region.
I think as well, when so many Americans are telling these pollsters that they don't understand the reason why the US is at war with Iran, that they feel the administration has failed to explain that, it's very hard to support something you don't really have knowledge of, and all you're seeing are these rising prices at the petrol pumps, and you're hearing on every possible media outlet and every part of your feed on your phone that that's because of the war in Iran. It's very hard to get behind that. But I think fundamentally, all of these kind of clashes between President Trump and Netanyahu, he always gets it back to a place where they're friends again. It isn't manifesting itself in any action other than harsh words, be it that F-bomb that you're talking about, Bernd, last year, or this latest one. There's no suggestion of, rolling back any military aid, any sanctions, any, price to pay for anything. It's just a few harsh words, and then things move on. And the president is clearly frustrated, as he said, about not being able to get an end to this situation in Iran. He can't give an answer to those people who are telling pollsters, when does it end? Why does it end? I don't understand this. He doesn't have a good answer for that yet.
No, he doesn't. And as you said, President Trump and previous U.S. presidents have had enormous leverage over Israel, in which they could have exercised some of that leverage to change particular policy or behavior that they thought wasn't benefiting the U.S., but they haven't done so. I just wonder if in the future that's going to, if this trend continues, whether that's still going to be politically acceptable in the long run, that, the ironclad commitment of the U.S. to Israel and kind of almost unconditional support for Israel, whether that can remain. If I was in the Israeli government, I think that would be my primary concern, kind of much longer than Trump.
I also wonder how much of this is tied to the specific figure of the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. When you see some of the polling that we were just referring to and the opinion of Israel, or at least support for Israel, that was all often ironclad among the American public, that diminishing a bit, whether that has to do with him or whether it's Israel at large and the U.S. relationship in the region. And the other thing I think about is how President Trump is really keen to move his Abraham Accords forward, so the normalization of ties between Israel and Gulf nations. And one of the big barriers to that right now is Israel and this prime minister's opposition to pursuing a two-state solution for the Palestinians. And that is obviously something that the Gulf nations, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, for example, have said they want to see a viable path towards that two-state solution. And so there's another block where the Israeli prime minister is possibly getting in the way of what President Trump sees as a key achievement for broader stability and partnerships in the region.
Yeah, I mean, his suggestion of a couple of weeks ago that a broader Iran deal be linked to all of those countries signing up to the Abraham Accords, again, there's reporting that that was on a conference call and there was a stony silence. Nobody said anything because the chances or the likelihood of any of those countries signing up to a plan to normalize their relations with Israel while Israel is bombing Lebanon, notwithstanding their pathways towards getting some sort of ceasefire deal on the table, like they just can't. They can't go to their domestic populations and do that. That just isn't, what they stand for and what they want or they believe in. So I think President Trump has kind of moved away from including that, although, as you say, it's such one of his signature achievements that he likes to reference time and again. But I think he's just getting frustrated with how he got into a war, and where we're at now at the moment, when you speak to experts, as we do on our programs, looks like something of a strategic failure for the US. It may have been militarily successful in parts of their objectives in Iran, but they've ended up with the situation where they're not in control of the Strait of Hormuz. It's not open freely as it was. There's a economic pressure on the whole world because of the stagnation in ships moving through there. And they can't agree a deal in terms of what happens next.
And I think it was kind of a communications failure. Those polls about petrol prices, for example, that suggests that the administration didn't convince the American public of the need for this war quite early on. And then there was also the issue of shifting timelines. At the very beginning, it was an issue of days and weeks. We're more or less 100 days in now. President Trump had said that he's going to make a final decision. That final decision has yet to come. I think all that just kind of compounds into one massive communications issue, which has come back to haunt the White House in terms of convincing the American public that this was necessary. President Trump keeps saying that he thinks the American public is willing to put up with those high prices for Iran not having a nuclear weapon, but just the polls don't show that to be the case.
And that's why increasingly you're seeing some of those questions raised on Capitol Hill, too. I thought it was interesting this week to see a war powers resolution pass in the House of Representatives. This is something that the White House, the president, had expressly warned Republicans against. And usually President Trump's word and his threats and his power hold full sway over that Republican coalition, the Republican caucus in Congress. And yet we started to see that peel away a little bit, first with two moderate and two libertarian, so 4 in total Republicans in the House of Representatives. But if you listen to some of the messaging we've heard from Republicans, both in the Senate and in the House of Representatives, and we speak to them as well, they've continued to kind of hedge their language on this to say, look, right now we're in a ceasefire, so it's not necessary to have a war powers resolution. But if this continues, if the hot phase of the war sparks up again, then it's something we have to come back to. It's almost like a plea to the White House to say, end this so we don't have to vote in favor of a war powers resolution, because that might be what we believe is right as members of Congress who have the authority to approve a war, or because our constituents are calling for it.
Yeah, and I think it's that key point about the constituents and the looming midterms. We are getting into the place where the rubber meets the road. We've been through so many primaries. The summer will be short. People are making up their minds August, September, how they're going to vote come November. And I think now is the point where you're seeing those members of Congress that you mentioned to me, also in the Senate, a similar but not the same bill had already passed, and 4 Republican senators also joined with Democrats there in passing that through the Senate. And I think it's because they're hearing this from their constituents. not even those senators, but others who have maybe large military communities in their states. There's a risk now, this ongoing talk of President Trump going to restart the war. It's hard to see where the gains would be there. Troops being committed and so on. That there's just this pressure bubbling up now that we're seeing Republicans starting to kind of take action and be able to have something that they can go back to their constituents and show, I voted against this. I'm doing my best to stop it. If the president decides to ignore Congress and ignore the traditional pathways, at least I'm on the record as having voted in the way that I believe.
And whenever the White House is asked about this, they kind of point to the primaries and say that President Trump still has enormous power over the party. But I think what's gone unacknowledged is that the primaries are a very specific scenario, and that's one thing. But a wider election, I think some Republicans have come to the conclusion that he's not quite as powerful in a kind of general election as he was in the past. There was an interesting quote in the New York Times from a political strategist who said that, some Republicans, especially in the Senate, are now actively seeking to distance themselves from President Trump a little bit, looking forward to, that next election.
But I always come back to President Trump. Yes, we're seeing some of that power ebb a bit, but I always come back to the idea that if he were to throw his full weight behind something, those Republicans very likely would fall in line. And, there's always the threat of a primary. Of course, many of those primaries are passed. And so that threat holds less currency, let's say, has less currency than it might have a few months ago. But that being said, President Trump knows that among Republican voters, and of course, those are the ones who are voting in those primary elections, he's still massively popular. And if he starts to continue to really pressure some of these Republicans to fall in line on this war and on many of his main agenda points, we didn't talk yet about the weaponization fund and just what a real disaster that has been for the administration and walking that back. You wonder how far they'll distance themselves.
Yeah, and that's a great point, isn't it? When we look back to last summer, the one big beautiful bill, President Trump really putting his thumb on the scales there, and Republicans eventually at the 11th hour all falling into line on that, even though they had very real concerns, some of them, about what it would mean for their specific districts. But I think now that many of them are through the primary season, that sort of period where the party is picking who's going to run against the Democrat in the general election or in the main congressional elections in the autumn, that they're a little more freed perhaps, and they are now thinking, well, I've beat off the other Republican, but now I have to beat off my opponent and I need something concrete going into that. And I think the weaponization fund was a really good example of one where the president just couldn't win. Such was the volume of the opposition to it from very, very senior members in the party. And then the threat that things were going to be attached to other legislation, which would just mean absolutely nothing moved anywhere, really was one where, I think the president didn't really have any choice. And that was kind of evident a little as well when he was speaking in the Oval Office the other day, and he was saying, I still really love that fund. I still really wish we could have it, or words to that effect, without justifying in any way why he had decided to pause it at this point.
And one wonders if the White House isn't concerned that the main takeaway for Republicans on Capitol Hill, the main lesson learned, is that there is room to push back. That was such a notable push. That was such a notable climb down from the White House, because there was quite a lot of fanfare around that, the weaponization fund. And it was something that President Trump clearly felt very strongly about and that he'd been thinking about for quite some time. And then they are very kind of abruptly reverse course. I think many Republicans on Capitol Hill will take that as a lesson that there is, in fact, room to push back in cases that they think are kind of, egregious, and they don't necessarily need to follow the White House's line.
And the next place that we might see that happening is this, acting nomination, if you like, as the Director of National Intelligence, Bill Pulte. If that becomes an actual nomination and Trump appoints him in a way that isn't just acting up and doing the job for the moment, but he has to seek Senate confirmation. We're already hearing from Republican senators about how they don't want him as the director of national intelligence. You know, a huge job in the intelligence community, not just in this country, but you're also the person that's interacting with the heads of intelligence services around the world. Crucially, the Five Eyes organization, the big countries that share intelligence with each other, of which the US is part. There's a lot of opposition to that, and I think, to your point, Bernd, they may look to this and say, okay, if we hold the line here, President Trump may just decide, no, sorry, Bill, stay on in your role at the Federal Housing Agency.
It's worth saying as well, I think in particular at this point, Bill Pulte has no national security and intelligence background. And this is why we're seeing that opposition. You know, we've seen the president now say that he'd like Todd Blanche no longer to be acting attorney general, but to be confirmed as attorney general. Well, Todd Blanche, yes, he was President Trump's personal lawyer. He is an attorney. So you understand the background there. Not the case with Bill Pulte. And I think that's one of the main reasons we're seeing this pushback, in addition to the fact that it is seen that Bill Pulte has really been very politicized in his language and the way that he's approached his job, his current job. And I was listening to just trying to understand how Republicans might message that they're not happy with this decision from the president. And I was listening to one congressman say, well, you know, it would be too many jobs for him. He's got such an important job at the Housing Authority, and I want him to make sure that he can really concentrate on that. And I thought, is that really the main concern you have about him taking up this role?
Yeah, because in that point, Marco Rubio springs to mind, doesn't he, as Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, amongst other things. But like, they're two huge roles that he has.
And the DNI job in particular, I think it's kind of one of the biggest jobs in government. There's 18 or so intelligence agencies within that kind of massive thing. I just think from a logistical standpoint, it would be very difficult to do that in something else. I think, you know, that's a concern that they can word in a way that isn't kind of directly against President Trump, and which I suspect we'll see a lot of in the coming days.
And it's caused just so much frustration, as we understand from reporting, among Republicans in Congress as well, because they have been crafting and working on this FISA authorization, which is, you know, a national security legislation that has been quite difficult for them to move across the line. And now with this nomination from President Trump, you have Democrats saying, look, I'll hold up this FISA legislation to make sure that Bill Pulte doesn't get this job. So, you know, it pushes that back 3 steps. So imagine Republicans in the Senate, kind of going back to the drawing board on that as well. And I think that might spark even further frustration with the White House.
The other point as well that Republicans are quite annoyed about was the ballroom, the new big ballroom at the White House, and the demolition of the East Wing to make room for it, which initially President Trump had said would be paid for by private donors. But suddenly then he was looking for $1 billion from Congress for, we're told, the security element of it. But that was another thing that I think people went back to their constituencies, and just the level of pushback from voters about how tone deaf this whole thing was, that people are struggling still with the cost of living. You add on top of that the rising price of oil and gas, which is making everything else go up. Inflation is on the way up. And suddenly the president was looking for all of this cash to build a big ballroom on the side of the White House. And we saw massive opposition to that. And an amendment now has actually been added to a piece of legislation removing and preventing the funding of that $1 billion for the ballroom.
And of course, that's not his only project. And there's, kind of some very high dollar big events coming up at the White House and in Washington in the next few months for the 250, for example. If the war in Iran is still going, one really wonders what public perception would be of, those sorts of enormous expenses being taken on at a time when people are, paying $4.50, $5 for petrol. I think there's a very strong chance that if that's the case, polls go quite badly for the president.
Well, that's something we'll talk about then in a future episode, but I guess that's all we have time for this week, guys. But great to see you as always.
Absolutely. Bye.
Hey, guys.
Bye.
If you enjoyed this episode of The President's Path, then like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We would love to hear from you, so please do leave us a comment below. or email us on path@bbc.co.uk.